Hello everyone, Sidewin here, and today I am going to be talking about the Warpriest subclass of the Cleric in Pathfinder Second Edition at level 3. This video is after my two previous videos on the Warpriest, and I will be expecting you to have watched those before watching this video. So if you have not, please go back to the start. So to start, there's a couple of changes from level 2 that the Warpriest gains. First off, they gain martial weapon proficiency at trained for all martial weapons rather than just their deity's weapon. So this can open up a lot of different options if, say, you're trained in athletics and you're using a lot of different athletic skill options. Say you're tripping a lot. You may want to have a weapon that lets you trip. Alternatively, you could just stick with your deity's weapon as a flavor thing. The second thing is that they gain 2 level 2 spell slots. I will be covering spell slots and spells in more depth later. You also gain 8 additional hit points on top of that if you have high constitution, and you gain a skill increase. Either 1 new skill proficiency at trained, or 1 of your skill proficiencies go to expert proficiency. Generally, the latter of these is more valuable if you are using a certain skill a lot, but if you're using a lot of different skills, you may want to pick one more up. You also gain a general feat, which I will be talking about later. So now, on to talking a bit about spells. First off, you can use your level 1 spells in your level 2 slots. This is called upcasting. You have to prepare them into these level 2 slots to be able to use them at a higher level. However, only some spells have an additional effect, so you should read carefully. For instance, Heal does have an additional effect, but then a lot of other spells, like Air Bubble for instance, do not have an additional effect. So casting it in a level 2 slot doesn't do anything extra. It's better to just prepare that in a level 1 slot. Now I'm going to highlight a couple of important level 2 spells to be aware of. However, there are a lot more, and a lot of them are very situational. So first off, the one thing I'll mention on that is that a lot of the level 2 cleric spells on the divine spell list are very undead related. For instance, one lets you mimic undead, one lets you harm undead, one lets you create undead, etc. So generally, if you're in an undead heavy campaign, the list you're going to go for is much different than if you're in a dungeon crawl. And some of these on this list are only really useful in dungeon crawls. So first off, Dispel Magic can counteract any magical effect in combat. It can also end negative effects out of combat. However, its major use is in combat because it'll let you, say, remove a deafened effect on an ally by ending the deafening spell. Then Restoration. Restoration is only out of combat. You cannot use it in combat, but it reduces a condition or disease stage. And I have it on here because it's useful in dungeon crawls. So for instance, if you're in a dungeon crawl with a lot of ghouls and someone failed against ghoul fever, this will let you keep them from dying of ghoul fever. However, it most likely will not end up actually treating the disease or condition because higher condition stages are oftentimes imposed by abilities. And you're using up spell slots. Number 3 is Sound Body. It is a in-combat action which lets you counteract certain conditions which can cause a lot of difficulty for certain classes. So for instance, Blinded. That's very, very bad for your attack spellcaster because a lot of spells say you have to see the target. And that's its main use. It just ends conditions which are causing trouble. Number 4 is Resist Energy. It takes 2 actions in combat. You can also precast it because it does last a little bit. And it grants resistance 5 to fire, cold, electricity, acid, or sonic damage. These are common in certain dungeons, and again, it's more of a situational spell, but if you know you're going to be fighting fire elementals, you might prepare it because it'll let you make your fighter take 5 less damage from the majority of their attacks. And then the last spell I'm highlighting here is Revealing Light. It forces a reflex save, and on a fail, it dazzles enemies and reveals invisible foes, making them concealed instead of invisible. This is useful in the cases of certain enemies that do just go invisible, because level 3 is about the time you will start seeing some of them. And dazzled is always a good condition to inflict. And then one final thing to note here is that you may also gain special spells from your deity at this level. Deities give spells at different levels. For instance, the god of magic, Nethys, gives a spell at every single level, but then most other deities only give it at free levels, which vary depending on what spells are flavorful. So always check your deity, because you may have one extra spell off, say, the primal or arcane list that is not on the divine list. The other thing to mention is read the full spell description with level 2 spells, and don't assume your knowledge from previous systems applies. An example is the spell Silence. Silence in Pathfinder 2e can only be used on a willing creature, whereas if you're coming from D&D like I am, it's an offensive spell. It's not in Pathfinder. So make sure you do read through. And then the final thing I'm going to talk a bit about is general feats. So I'm not listing any of them here because there's something like 200 of them. And each one is very, very specific by skill. So if you have one skill and you don't have another, you can't get a very good feat because you just don't have that skill. So I have a few prerequisites basically for deciding whether you should take it. So first off, the first question is always, can I make use of this ability or can I not? And this is very dependent on the campaign you're playing. For instance, if you're playing Knights of Lastfall or an undead-heavy campaign, you may want more of the healing abilities, because perhaps you have an undead ally, and your heal spell doesn't work on them, and you only have the healing font. You don't have harming font. So that generally lets you suit to that campaign. Alternatively, in a very social-oriented campaign, you may want the social feats. For instance, being able to intimidate lots of people rather than one. That's a general feat, because general feats include all the skill feats. And then the second thing to consider is, do you actually want the ability, or do you just feel obligated to take it? The latter can be a good motivator, but it's also not necessary, because sometimes things feel necessary when they're not. So first off, general feats do not usually significantly impact a build. They can impact it pretty heavily in certain cases, but usually casters are not those cases. And then there is one caveat to just pick whatever looks cool. You still want your feats to work together, because if you're a person who just random rolls all your feats, you're going to be far less effective than someone who actually reads through them and decides. And the note with the build sometimes relying on it is, if you are relying on it, your build might rely on a specific feat chain, so you may need to take one feat at level 3 to have another feat at level 7. So lots of different things to weigh, but let's note those usually apply to marshals, not casters. Then the next one is, how can you use the ability? Is it for in combat or out of combat? Like, is your character generally more biased on one or the other? Do you want to catch up one side more than the other? It just varies. But you should always read the entire feat before picking, because sometimes feats do not do what the title suggests, just like spells, really. So, Chill Touch does not literally chill someone as a spell. Sometimes feats work much the same. And then, if you're using Path Builder, this is unnecessary, but the question is, do you have all the prerequisites? And if you have to succeed at checks to use your new feat, you should ensure you have a high bonus to do so, because having a feat that you spent stuff to get just fail repeatedly is not a fun time. That is all for today. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the future.